let us start. I'll try to make my introduction as short as possible. So, Russian and East European Studies Network at Queen's, REES, presents its second event in the End of History, Memory, Politics in Eastern Europe, 30 years after the Cold War series. And today's conversation brought together scholars of Polish history and politics from both Poland and Canada. And we'll tackle the following topic: mnemonic capital, writing and rewriting history in today's Poland. Professor Piotr Wróbel, Konstanty, Reynert, Chair of Polish Studies and History Department at the University of Toronto, will introduce panelists and moderate the discussion. I'm very sorry for these technical issues, and let's start.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me introduce the panelists. As you know, a war over history has been waged in Poland. Poland is not that original. The same war takes place in many places all over the world. But I believe that Poland belongs among those countries where this war over history is particularly acute. And so it's worth discussing it to have some maybe universal conclusions. And today, there are two scholars from Poland who will discuss this issue. Both of them are or were connected to Polin, Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And this is not a coincidence, because Jewish history is obviously in the center of this war over history. So if you say something about Jewish history, well, we can already know who are you, where are you coming from, to what school you belong. So I will introduce the panelists in alphabetical order, or maybe this is also a chronological order. Our first panelist is Professor Dariusz Stola, who's a professor at the Institute of Political Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences. Now, as you probably know, there are two kinds of professors in Poland. There are university professors, and this is just a job. This is an academic position. And there is a scholarly title awarded by the president of Poland to particularly outstanding professors, and this is a title for life. And Professor Stola was awarded this title by the president of Poland in 2013. Professor Stola graduated from the University of Warsaw, where he studied history, and then he was busy in many places for some time. He was at the Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. It's a school of social sciences, where he was vice president and director for international cooperation. And he was active as a historian all the time. But in 2014, he was appointed the director of Polin, Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And this was probably his most important position. Under his directorship, the museum blossomed. If you are in Warsaw, please go to Polin. This is one of the most interesting objects in Warsaw, probably in Central Europe. And as a proof, we can say that in 2016, when Professor Stola was the director there, the museum won the European Museum of the Year award, granted for European Museum Forum, which is working under the Council of Europe. So the European Museum of the Year Award 2016. This is a very prestigious award. Other institutions which got the award are like Victoria and Albert Museum, British Galleries in London. So this is the really first league of European museums. Professor Stola was appointed the director of this museum in 2014. And again, this was not a coincidence. Professor Stola published 7 books and about 150 articles. And among those books, there are several books devoted to Jewish history, like Hope and Destruction, Ignacy Schwarzbart, Jewish representative of the Polish National Council, 1940-1945, or the anti-Zionist campaign in Poland, 1967-1968. He works in other fields as well, demography. His book, A Country with No Way Out, Migrations from Poland, 1949-1989, is an outstanding piece of scholarship as well. Unfortunately, in 2019, and this is a part of our discussion today, so I don't want to talk too much about it. Unfortunately, in 2019, the Minister of Culture in the government of Law and Justice, and maybe you know that this is a party which became the ruling party in Poland in 2015. According to my opinion, this is a conservative Catholic nationalistic party. So it seems that the narrative presented by the Polin Museum was not aligned really with the historical policies of the new government. And in 2019, the Minister of Culture did not renew Professor Stola's contract as the director of the museum. There was a stalemate because the authorities decided to start a search, and Professor Stola won the search in a spectacular way. So there was a stalemate. After a while, the government decided to appoint a previous deputy director, Zygmunt Stępiński, as an acting director, and last year he became the director of the museum. So this is Professor Stola, and the second participant of our panel is Dr. Michał Trębacz, who graduated from the University of Łódź, or if you prefer an anglicized version, University of Lodz. He also defended his PhD over there. In 2014, his PhD was devoted to the life of Israel Lichtenstein, a Polish socialist, and Dr. Trębacz published a book under this title devoted to Israel Lichtenstein. Dr. Trębacz worked at the University of Łódź, and he's still there as a professor at the professor at the Center for Jewish Research of this university. But in 2017, he became the head of research department at the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. So both of our participants are connected to the museum, and both of them are really close to this issue, war over history, discussion, conflict over history. So this is my introduction, and Professor Stola, would you start? Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for this generous introduction. Actually, Piotr has not mentioned that when I was a student of history at the Warsaw University, he was an assistant professor at the same university. It was some 40 years ago, to my knowledge. Let me start with 2 points, somehow expanding the horizon of our reflection, which is, Piotr has mentioned the war about history, war about the past in Poland, which is not the first war. Actually, the term, to my knowledge, was introduced for the first time by Professor Andrzej Paczkowski, the Dean of Historians of Communist Poland, in relation to the conflict about the understanding of the past back in Communist Poland in the 1980s. And that was the conflict between the Solidarity movement, the opposition, democratic opposition, and the communist government. And the communist government, the Communist Party, lost this battle. Namely, it could not produce convincing popular narratives, while the opposition was very strong. It had several assets to undermine and delegitimize the Communist Party rule. It was one of the factors that led to the peaceful transition from communist dictatorship to parliamentary democracy in 1989. But an important experience, I believe, of some of the actors of this political history. And one of these actors was Mr. Jarosław Kaczyński, now the leader of the Law and Justice, the populist party running Poland for a few years now. And I think this historical experience is interesting. Then we had the second war in history, which was somehow a radicalization of the critique of the communist rule in Poland that began in the late 1990s after electoral victories of the post-communist party, the Social Democratic Party, in the 1990s. And here, kind of a milestone is the establishment of the Institute of National Remembrance, a new agency which was invented to some extent following the example of the German Gaukbehörde, first to deal with, to make accessible the archive of the Communist Security Service. That was the primary function. But then gradually the institution expanded into something which I call the Agency for the Past, or the Ministry of Memory, but not in the Orwellian sense of the term, but rather as an expression of the etatist thinking. And for me, the etatist thinking is that when you have a problem, you establish a ministry. So this is what happened, and the Institute of National Remembrance, the Polish acronym IPN is widely used, is an important actor in the story which I'm going to present. And I would like also to give you some three perspectives from the political science on the topic. One, we have started with Kate Korycki, concept of the mnemonic capital. And what I like in this context is that for some politicians, the past is not a task, it's not a burden, it's not for some retributive justice or commemoration, but it's an asset. It's something you can capitalize on to produce electoral profits, political profits, build your influence, build your legitimacy, and attack your opponents, delegitimize your opponents. Second perspective comes from Michael Barnard and Jan Kubik, now American political scientists, who published several years ago a fantastic book about the commemoration of the 1989 revolutions in 2009 for the 20th anniversary of the peaceful revolutions, mostly peaceful revolutions of 1989. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe organized commemorations, and Barnard and Kubik edited a volume on this topic and also offered some analytical instruments to understand the different actors, political actors. And among others, they have introduced the term mnemonic warriors for certain political strategies and political actors active in the field of public memory. Finally, the third perspective, which I would encourage you to take, is by Kornelia Kończal, a Polish scholar working now in Germany, who introduced the term of mnemonic populism. And I will explain later on what it means, mnemonic populism, for her. What is interesting, you have three political scientists using the term mnemonic and militarist terms for the description of how it may be deployed or exploited as the mnemonic capital of Kate Korycki. And I would like also to stress the importance of the institutional landscape. Not only policies, not only tendencies, not only what are the popular perceptions of the past or the way the public imagines the past, but what are the institutions dealing with the past in Poland. So first, Kate Korycki stressed this, that the past or memory may be political capital. that in Poland, where programmatic identities of Polish political parties are weak, the differences in terms of economic policy or the role of the states are not as radical as you can imagine. They're relatively mild. And she has claimed that despite this weakness, political competition is fierce, and political parties, to maintain a clearer, a sharper identity, they actually invest in conflicts in other fields. And one of the fields is the past. When I use the term memory, I have very specific understanding of this memory. And these are, in fact, not what people actually remember from when they were young, but how do they imagine the past? What are the popular ways of imagining the past and judging the past? This is the memory as I am going to use it now. So this is something really interesting about politics in Poland, because the differences about the memory policies and the images of the past are much sharper than the political programs in other fields. And they actually serve as probably the most important differentia specifica of the leading political parties, with the party of Mr. Kaczyński, the Populist Party, actually having the clearest, the sharpest position, which actually gives it quite a lot of political profits. Michael Barnard and Jan Kubik, when they were analyzing these commemorations in 2009, they have noted that there were three kinds of political actors, three ways of dealing with the past during this commemoration. One was mnemonic pluralists. We may call them liberal Democrats. That means people who assume that people may have different opinions about the past. We should have some shared understanding about some events of the past, but otherwise citizens and various groups may differ, and this is okay. Another group were abnegationists, people who just didn't want to talk about the past, and these were mostly post-communists, and they had good reasons not to talk about it. That was not an asset for them. And finally, they identified mnemonic warriors, and they identified the two most important mnemonic warriors in 2009, and that was Mr. Orban and Mr. Kaczyński. So when I read this book years later, I realized how perceptive it was. And second, that these were the only two people who were still in power, which means maybe it's successful, maybe it's effective. Maybe the strategy of the mnemonic warriors pays off. And I suppose it may pay off under certain conditions, and I'll come back to this in a second. And finally, Cornelia Kończal, in her article, which I encourage you to read, on mnemonic populism, writes that this is, let me quote, poly-driven, manifestly moralistic and anti-pluralist imagining of the past. Poly-driven, manifestly moralistic and anti-pluralist, a very good combination of features. Poly-driven means there is solid social research behind allegedly irrational, emotional policies of the Populist Party in Poland. I'm quite convinced, although we don't have any hard data to prove it, but it seems that we know they do a lot of social research, and they also do social research on memory. And in some fields that the Populist Party has chosen as the battlefield for the memory wars, the discrepancies between popular opinions and academic history and the opinions of more moderate parties are especially visible. And here, the best known field is the field of the Polish-Jewish relations and the Holocaust. We know from several public opinion polls that about half of Poles believe that ethnic Poles suffered as much as Jews or more than Jews during the Second World War. And information that may be shocking and surprising for external observers, but we have consistent data from several studies reflecting this attitude, which doesn't fit with the image provided by academic historiography, and especially academic historiography of the past 30 years. And the Populist Party was very eager to exploit this gap, to capitalize on certain emotions connected, and in particular the emotion of the feeling that the suffering of ethnic Poles has not been recognized properly. This is interesting. We see it also in a quite distant country, in Armenia, there is a widespread feeling among Armenians that the genocide was not sufficiently internationally recognized, which correlates with quite strong levels of anti-Semitism as measured with the Anti-Defamation League standard. So there is something similar in Poland. Some people call it secondary anti-Semitism. It's related to this perceived abuse of Jews of the past suffering to make some political or economic profits. So clearly, this is the case in Poland. The Populist Party policy is also manifestly moralistic. They keep talking about the truth, justice, national honor, dignity, protecting the good image and the good name of the Polish nation, of Polish heroes, of Polish innocent victims. It's poll-driven, but very emotional and very moralistic. And third, it's anti-pluralist. They cannot tolerate alternative narratives. And here I come to the next part of my presentation, which is what was the policy of the Populist Party in gradually taking control of the past by taking control of the institutions that are key in building public imagery of the past. So it started with the takeover of the Institute of National Remembrance in 2016, when PiS won the parliamentary elections and presidential elections that coincided in the same year in 2015. They were quite quick in 2016 to change the law on the institute, which allowed them for direct political control of the institute. Under the previous government, there was a mechanism which was shielding the institute from direct political intervention by quite a complex procedure of electing the president of the institute. The institute itself was established in the late 1990s as very independent from both the executive and the legislative. It was to protect it against the post-communist party, against possible hostile takeover by the Communist Party. So PiS exploited this, changed the procedures to appoint a completely loyal person as its president, Mr. Szpytma, who was then quick to fire some independent historians. Some other historians just left it quickly, and soon IPN became a loyal tube of the PiS historical propaganda, and then largely expanded. Its annual budget almost doubled within these years. Now it's almost $500 million zloty annually. It's dominating in several fields, including publishing on history. This is the biggest publisher of books on history in Poland with huge budgets. So the takeover was in 2016, and since this moment, IPN was first losing its authority as a place of research and growing in importance as a place of propaganda and indoctrination. What is also interesting about IPN is that, as I said, it was established as a government agency, but it had a research department with quite a number of respected historians. So, for example, the key two-volume publication on the Jedwabne killing of Jews in 1941 was produced by IPN. And to this moment, it remains a solid and reliable source of information. However, with the proper legal changes and these political appointees controlling key positions in the institute, it became a model for an important sub-strategy of taking over of the past, namely making of pseudo-academic institutions. Institutions that do history research, that publish academic books, but do not have autonomy of academic institutions, do not enjoy the autonomy that the universities have in Poland or the Polish Academy of Sciences institutes. And this is quite a dangerous path. I mean, dangerous for Polish academia and for the quality of research in Poland. The example of IPN was then replicated with the Pilecki Institute, a completely new institution established first as a project to publish the documents on Nazi crimes, quite reasonable initiative, but then again expanded funded very generously. And I think it's about 90 million zloty budget annually for the last year, which is a kind of the IPN soft. It doesn't engage into aggressive propaganda of the memory policy of the ruling party, is more restrained. It tries to keep certain standards, but it is politically controlled. And most recently, we have had the farthest reaching attempt at creating these parallel academic institutions, namely the Minister of Education and Science. There was a leak from the ministry that the government intends to establish a second parallel Academy of Sciences in Poland, because they cannot control the existing one. It is to establish the parallel institution, which with much more of saying by politicians than in the existing academy. Next step in this hostile takeover of the institutions was the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk, a flagship project of memory policy of the previous government, large museum, invented, designed, established by respected historians. Mr. Kaczyński, even before they won the elections, was speaking very clearly what they were going to do with it. He was speaking that the museum is not going to offer a Polish perception of war, a Polish truth, and he didn't hide the intention of changing it, which actually happened, but gradually. Our colleagues at the Museum of the Second World War offered really courageous resistance, and they engaged in a protracted legal battle, which gave them time to complete the core exhibition, open the museum, and let thousands of people see the exhibition before eventually the government fired the directors, put in a political appointee, a person completely loyal to the ruling party, actually an activist of the ruling party, and which then tried to make some changes to the core exhibition. And for me, these changes to the core exhibition, they were not so much to radically alter the narrative. The narrative was criticized by the populist party as insufficiently militaristic, showing not enough the positive aspects of war. And I'm quoting, the positive aspects of war were not sufficiently presented in this museum. For me, the changes were to justify the takeover. I believe it was primarily about eliminating a competition, eliminating a powerful, influential institution, and we can discuss why they believe museums are especially powerful in shaping the images of the past. So I'm especially grateful to our colleagues at the Museum of the Second World War for the legal battle, because it gave us time at Polin Museum. I knew since the attacks against the museum in Gdańsk started that next in line is the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Why? Because it was new, it was attractive, it was influential. We, with 500,000 visitors annually, and an excellent image in the media, both in Poland and abroad. It was clearly a place that could not remain independent. So the attack started in 2018, and I'm not going very much into the details. If you want to ask, you can ask me questions. But this time, the attack was only partially successful. That means, yes, the government managed to remove me, and my best known achievement in museology is to lose my job at a museum, but it didn't manage to take control of the institution. And it ended with a kind of a compromise, namely my deputy becoming first the acting director and eventually the director. But soon the pandemic started, and for the time being, the war on the past and the systematic policy of taking over cultural institutions has been suspended, because during the pandemics, museums are a liability, costly liability, not an asset. But I'm pretty sure soon after the pandemic is over, the battle will start again. And the third case of a museum was the European Solidarity Center, the new museum of the Solidarity movement established in the land of the Gdańsk shipyard, where the movement began, which, like the Polin Museum, has a complex legal structure. Polin Museum is a public-private partnership between the government of Poland, the city of Warsaw, and the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute, which represents the Jewish community and historians. In Gdańsk, this is the trade union Solidarity, the city of Gdańsk, the Ministry of Culture, and the foundation of Lech Wałęsa as the ex-leader of the union. So in the case of the Solidarity Museum, the government first tried to remove its director, Basil Kerski. It failed. Why? Because the key player is the city of Gdańsk, is the, I would say, the major partner in this partnership of several institutions. Basil Kerski won again the competition for his position. The ministry didn't manage to remove him. Then the ministry demanded its own, another largely independent deputy director with his or her own department, which basically was to break the institution into two pieces. And again, the museum was defended, and then the ministry first cut its subsidy radically by several million zloty, and then established a parallel institution with the same mission. So now in Gdańsk, you have the Museum of the Solidarity Movement, the European Solidarity Center, and you have a virtual existing institution of a similar name and similar mission, which the government will certainly develop. And this is the wisdom. If you cannot control something, establish a parallel institution. By the way, for the Polin Museum, there is also a parallel institution, the Warsaw Ghetto Museum, established by the Ministry of Culture with a clear understanding that will be a much better museum of Jewish history than the Polin Museum of the history of Polish Jews. Again, generously funded, no restrictions and so on. So here you have the tactics of taking over. Then the institutions that are taken over are generously funded. The budgets of all these institutions that were taken over were expanded massively, and the loyalty of political appointees was tested, and they were loyal. They do what they are told to do all the time. So it works. There are also new institutions, and I have a long list of museums that were formally established, that are under construction, and are to be opened again. Actually, it's a very long list. I'm not going to give you the full list of it, but the biggest one is the Museum of the History of Poland, under construction now. Recently opened Piłsudski Museum, the Museum of John Paul II and Cardinal Wyszyński in Warsaw. We have two museums of the so-called cursed soldiers, of the anti-communist guerrilla soldiers of the post-war period. And in the plans, we have one more museum of the righteous Poles who were saving the Jews during the war, which is to open in Warsaw. This is the most recent invention. So in Warsaw, we'll have two Jewish museums plus a museum of Poles who are rescuing Jews. So as you see,
Professor Stola, forgive me this, please, but you have 2-3 minutes.
I think I have, yes, I have 2 minutes. Yes, I have a timer. So does it work? I think, yes, it works. In terms of public pedagogy, in terms of propaganda, it works by saturating the public space with all kinds of messages that block possibly alternative narratives of the past. And here I should add about the online strategies of the ruling party, which is much more ahead in terms of exploiting the social networks than the parties of the opposition. So it works in terms of public pedagogy. The question is how lasting the changes in the public memory of the past will be. This is unclear. I don't know. I'm skeptical because I remember the big loss of the Communist Party, which controlled almost everything and still was ineffective in providing attractive and lasting narratives about the past. However, it certainly does not work with the academia. We can rather see a stiffening opposition among academic historians, even those who initially, some of those who initially supported the ruling party are increasingly skeptical. Maybe it's a matter of personal morality or ethics, maybe it's something else, but here I don't see it effective. And I don't expect that the objective of producing a new elite for the country, including the new elite in historiography, will work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, Dr. Trębacz. Dr. Trębacz is talking to us from Imre Kertész College in Jena, in Germany, where he works on a biography of Shmuel Zygielbojm, who was the second Jewish representative to the Polish National Council during World War II. So in a way, they are connected. Both our speakers are connected, well, intellectually in terms of their field, because as I said before, Professor Stola worked on Ignacy Schwarzbart. Now Dr. Trębacz is working on Shmuel Zygiel-Boehm. Dr. Trębacz, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. And second of all, thank you for your kind introduction. And I'm happy after listening what Professor Stola said that our speeches will differ more than I presume they will. So I will start with the fact that I would like to look at the issue we raised today from the 2 points of view. And let me start with the attempt to outline the situation in which Polish historians found themselves. And then I will present the ways of functioning of the researchers in this new reality. And I will refer both to institutionally to the attempts of the institutionally defend the pluralism in historical research, and to the activities of the individual research or informal groups. And I will only take a look at the activities of the part that is closer to mine understanding of the history and its social role. So to those who look at the past critically. Professor Stola presented the process of taking control over academic and cultural institutions that co-create the image of Poland's past. And I'm aware that I can repeat myself in some aspects, but I hope that you will forgive me for this. The process described by him is one of the measures aimed at achieving the goal set by the Polish authorities. That is the marginalization of critical history and strengthening the positive, not to say megalomaniacal vision of Polish history. The institutions of which Professor Stola spoke under the new management are designed to emphasize the glorious cards of the Polish past, even at the cost of deliberate distortions. A special place here is occupied by the history of the Holocaust, as he already said, or to say broadly, on Polish-Jewish relations in the 20th century. A positive vision of the history of Poland in the story is a story of heroes and its their heroic deeds. In this history, Casimir the Great of the Piast dynasty is equal to Charles the Great of Anjou, and Witold Pilecki, together with Jan Kalski, would have stopped Holocaust if only the Western allies would listen to them. This process led to a situation where for some academics and politicians, history and historians have a purely didactic or maybe propaganda task to describe the past, so that it not only raises the spirits among Poles, but becomes a weapon in the fight for a good name of Poland abroad, and that is the most important part. I would like to emphasize that the process described by Professor Stola did not close the debate in Poland. He also said that there is still a growing concern about the freedom of research here in Poland, and of course it made it difficult, but I will describe how later in my speech. Most of all, however, it contributed to personal changes in the research and cultural institutions. This does not mean that all places where the independent research is carried out have been closed. Universities and Polish Academy of Science still functions, and there is a pressure above that is growing and is visible, but it has not yet led to a radical change there. We have cultural institutions such as the museum, the Polin Museum, and local, smaller self-government museums and associations all around the country, which role cannot be undermined. Nevertheless, historians are under constant pressure expressed by the politicians, journalists, as well as academic institutions, such as the Institute of National Remembrance or the Pilecki Institute. An example of such an indirect pressure is the sentence passed in the trial of two professors, editors of the publication Night Without End, The Fate of Jews in Selected Counties of Occupied Poland. That is Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski. This judgment is the culmination of a long-standing campaign undermining their credibility as historians and the credibility of their team of researchers. Convicting them in a civil trial for providing incorrect information in one of the footnotes of a 2-volume over 1,700,000 pages collective work, but most of all, an involvement in the trial of the pro-government foundation, the Polish League Against Defamation, will certainly make many researchers think deeply before undertaking a critical reflection on the attitude of the Polish majority towards the ethnic and religious minorities in the 20th century. In this brief way, I'm trying to describe something that is very complicated and is a very complicated phenomena. That would require an analysis of press articles, speeches given by academics and commentators. It all adds up to the atmosphere in which historians work. Officially, nothing prevents you from taking up a research topic of your choice, as well as conducting and publishing its results. However, in the face of the explicit and recently even explicitly expressed by Minister of Science, the preferred, as he said, subjects of research, there is no room for critical history anymore, but rather for a hagiographic one. The former was simply called, and I quote again, the Polish minister, anti-Polish. So not even foreign, it was carried out against the Polish raison d'etat. It should also be added that there is a growing concern about whether researchers that does not fit into the specific political line will gain funding at all. When choosing the topic of work, many academics will probably consider whether it is possible to implement it without obtaining a grant from the Polish state. The situation was aggravated by the statement of the newly appointed Minister of Science, Przemysław Czarnek, when he said, and I quote again, "We lack serious historical projects that would discover the truth about Poland, about Poles, about how many Poles at what cost saved Jews during the Second World War." End of quotation. And it's completely clear statement that those historians who decide to research the paradigms indicated by the new minister can count on the state funding. Other activities, such as manual control of the publication scores in publishing houses and journals, are expected to make it difficult for the rebellious researchers to meet the requirements imposed on them by the universities, as well as to publish in prestigious publishing houses. It is also, and perhaps above all, a form of pressure on the academics to publish in specific Polish publishing houses. Sometimes those journals have no international recognition. The most prestigious Polish journal on the history of Holocaust, that is the Zagłada Żydów Studia I Materiały, were not only deprived of the ministerial funding, but also were rated the lowest on the scale of the academic journals by the Ministry of Science. We found ourselves in the situation in which not only the views of researchers, but also the researchers themselves are being under attack. Of course, it's worth noting that there is still a large space for free expression of views. That's free media, TV, press, and above all, the internet. This new medium has revolutionized the way history is presented and criticized. However, this is a topic for a completely different discussion. At this point, I would like to only emphasize the positive role as means of presenting independent views. And the COVID pandemic made it even more clear for us that it gives the opportunities that we didn't have ever before. I will now turn to the presentation of selected methods of savings. Though maybe this is save it is a too strong word to use. The historical debate, the freedom of the historical debate. First of all, I think it is worth stating that with some systematic solutions that have proven to be effective. And Professor Stola already told about the unsuccessful attempt to take over the Polin Museum, showed that at the time of establishing the institution, it is necessary to adopt statuses that will limit the possibility of freely changing their management related to changes at the highest levels of the government. Increased social participation in co-creating museums and other institutions is also extremely important. It turned out to be important both during the discussion on the change of the management of the Museum of the Second World War and also in the case of the Polin Museum. In the second one, this include the donors who largely contributed to the establishment and operation of this institution, protested against the attempts to change the director of the museum. Similarly, during the dismissal of the director of the Museum of the Second World War, Paweł Marcewicz, the donors, although in this case these were those who donated their souvenirs, memorables to the museum, threatened to take them away from the institution if the director will be changed. In my opinion, the social pressure coming from the outside the historical milieu is of a great importance. It allows us to believe that the culture or academic institution can be units integrated with society, guaranteeing their independence. An equally interesting idea is the initiative of the Polish Historical Society, which decided to try to adopt a code of ethics to be binding on historians. It covers all this code of ethics covers all the fields of activity related to research, publishing, teaching, both in schools and academia, and popularizing knowledge. Without doubt, the PHS, Polish Historical Society Code, is for the first time drawing a framework of behavior that historians can navigate in order not to be exposed and to expose themselves on the accusations of leaving the profession in favor of ethically questionable practices. I do not want to conduct a detailed analysis of this document, but only draw attention to some elements contained in it. First of all, the very fact that the Society of Polish Historians is working on such an initiative shows that something bad is happening to the historical research in Poland. The authors recall, among others, about the importance of the fair review process, point out that the discussion is not a dispute with the person, but with their views. Moreover, they remind how plagiarism and self-plagiarism are reprehensible and unacceptable practices. Secondly, they refer to above mentioned attempts by courts to limit the freedom of historical research. Moreover, the authors of the code write directly, and I quote, "One should also oppose the falsification of the image of the past in current disputes and attempts by politicians to impose false interpretations of history and limit of freedom of research, or the freedom of discussion by institutions and political parties," end of quotation. Regardless of how we assess the potential effectiveness of the enforcement of such provisions, it must be admitted that their introduction gives new arguments to the discussion with people who violate these standards. The idea of PHS members, as glorious, shows the capitulation of the universities, which should ensure that these standards are respected by their students, alumni, and staff. I will go on to the discussion what the historical debate in Poland looks like in the face of the facts described here by me and also before me by Professor Stola. The first immediately obvious conclusion is that there has been an incredible polarization of the historical society, which has led to the creation of two independent environments, or even camps. They are concentrated around various institutions, academic journals, and daily newspapers. Personnel changes taking place in institutions such as Second World War Museum or the Institute of National Remembrance strongly divided historians. Some researchers supported such solutions and even put their names there, which was rightly considered by others as a manifestation of their political commitment. It was a turning point for Polish historians. The division that developed then continues to deepen. We could observe it in at least two situations. The first was the publication of the book that I already mentioned, that is The Night Without End. And the Institute of National Remembrance prepared a response in the form of an extensive review, actually a separate book or a leaflet, I don't know how to call it. Some historians were indignant by the fact that such a work was created from a grant awarded by the state institutions, I mean the book. Its most unrepentant opponents did not even notice the fact that the book was not about the Polish crimes against the Jews during the Second World War, but was devoted to the destruction of the Jewish population in specific areas, starting in 1939 and ending in 1944-1945. Due to this situation, the work edited by Engel, King, and Grabowski did not receive an in-depth critical review on which it deserves. The second event, at least in Poland, of course, the second event, which probably finally showed how much division we are dealing with, was the visit of Polish historians to the conference that was held in Paris in spring 2019, that was titled New School of History of the Holocaust. And there were members of the Pilecki Institute and Institute of National Remembrance that were appointed to this conference, that were sent by these institutions to the conference, and the mission of these employees of those aforementioned institutions was to report on what was said during the conference, report in media, report in internet, but also to disrupt the meeting by making long statements that prevented the normal proceeding of the meetings. These are, of course, there are, of course, many other examples that have fundamentally undermined the integrity of the work carried out by some institutions, such as founding of the Warsaw Ghetto Museum. But the ones just presented here are, in my opinion, the most significant. If you look at them and you are not aware of the broader context, it's hardly to say that reprehensive to write a review of a book. It is also difficult to consider participation in a conference to be beyond the accepted academic standards. However, we are dealing here with crossing of the thin line that the authors of the Polish Historical Society Code of Ethics seem to have in mind. The review did not engage in polemics with the book thesis, but was only an attempt to point out the author's mistakes, interpretation errors, etc. It was formulated in such a way as to undermine and discredit their credibility, not their findings. Doubts were also raised by the fact that in a fairly short time, one author with a very modest academic achievement in the history of the Holocaust was able not so much to read the text on nearly 2,000 pages, but to scrupulously analyze the footnotes, reach for sources of various provenance to check whether the article has not changed the content of the cited document. In turn, the events in Paris clearly showed that the specifically understood Polish raison d'etat will allow historians to spy on their colleagues, because I cannot find other way to call what they did there. As a result, both groups closed almost completely. Critical history advocates have recognized, rightly so, that there is no point in arguing with most of the other side representatives. What was a fact a few years ago, for example, a conference organized together by the Institute of National Remembrance and the Polish Center for Holocaust Research, with the participation of Jan Tomasz Gross, seems to be a distant past right now. It is the debates, organization, and participation in the academic works and workshops and conferences that are the most visible symptoms of the ongoing change here. The Institute of National Remembrance or the Pilecki Institute are no longer able to organize a conference on Jewish studies whose partners will be most prestigious institutions from Europe, North America, or Israel. At the events organized by them, it is also in vain to look for the most important researchers of the Holocaust from Poland. The employees of both institutions have also stopped attending events organized by the other entities. It is difficult for me to judge whether this is happening because they are not willing to participate or are they not invited to participate. There has been a situation where it is more and more difficult to organize a discussion in which we deal with the conversation between two people expressing different views. The rationale for these attitudes is that giving them the opportunity to speak is sanctioning their political decisions. Unfortunately, this also leads to the extreme in which even substantive statements of the adversaries, which does not raise any fundamental doubts, are ignored or discredited only because of who utters them. However, part of the community, of the historical community, remains open to the discussion and tries to invite people whom it defines as the representatives of the different views. This approach assumes that it is impossible to make any change without openly discussing with each other. This is undoubtedly a more difficult task, and it is rightly indignant. Often in such cases, we are dealing with two monologues rather than a conversation, which in no way contributes to the end of the division. Therefore, the role of moderators and organizers of such meetings is crucial. The goal may not be the dispute itself, but an attempt at a matter-of-fact discussion of specialists in a given field, which also reflects in the discussed ethics code. The recent trial of Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski has shown that the latter approach is, however, quite naive. The Institute of National Remembrance and Pilecki Institute did not speak against the organization of this process. Such letters were issued by the Polin Museum, the Polish Academy of Science, Iwo Institute, and many, many others all around the world. The employees of these institutions, I mean the EPN and Pilecki Institute, seemed to be blind to the atmosphere in which the trial was taking place. Moreover, they omitted the fact that the indictment was financed by the Polish League Against Defamation, and thus de facto by the Polish government. This situation only confirmed that the division of the historical milieu is extremely strong, and I say this with a broken heart, permanent. It is a pity that it proved that one of the parties of the dispute is also blind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have about half an hour for your questions. So please go ahead. I will establish a list here and I will invite you to ask questions. Go ahead. Who's first? No. Well, if you don't have questions, I do have a lot of questions, as a matter of fact. Professor Lehrer, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm actually on my phone outside, so I don't know if it's a good connection.
It's a very good phone. Go ahead.
Perfect, wonderful, so good to know. I just wanted to follow up because Professor Stola mentioned in passing that he had some thoughts about why museums were either particularly targeted or particularly good spaces for sort of promulgating historical narratives. And so I just wanted to ask if he could clarify that or say more about it, about what is it particularly about museums in this discussion that is powerful.
Thank you very much. Let's collect 2 questions more, and then we will ask the panelists to answer. Who's next? Don't be shy. Professor Ostapchuk? No? Okay. Unmute yourself, please. Unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. Oh, I listened with great interest. And My question, I don't have a question, but some thoughts about this whole problematic. I mean, you have Polish memory vis-a-vis the Germans, vis-a-vis Jews, which is largely an internal matter, vis-a-vis Ukrainians, which is also an internal and external matter, especially today. And I'm sort of wondering how okay, these three loci, these three spheres sort of compare as amount of energy, money, attention, and perceived importance of these memory spheres goes. Of course, the one with Ukrainians is very, very problematic. On one hand, there's been a great service done by bringing up what happened in Volyn, which many, I suppose, as a Ukrainian, a son of nationalists, did not know about as we grew up, and we learned quite a lot of things. On the other hand, there's this constant memory war, this who's more guilty, who suffered more, who, this engagé dehumanization that goes, which is for history, we're talking about history, is not a good thing. I mean, at best it becomes publicistica, and at worst it becomes just, trash. So if anybody has any thoughts on that problematic, it'd be interesting to hear.
Thank you very much. Professor Dębińska, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this discussion. I was just wondering what is the process of peer reviewing, and what is the situation now with publishing books? Where do historians publish books? What is the university press standards? How the Akademia Wydawnictwa Naukowe is, how they work, and is it well, what's the process of the peer reviewing? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. The panelists, you have a lot of stuff to talk about. Please go ahead.
Who's to speak first?
You are speaking first. Go ahead.
Okay. So first, about Rika's question on the power of museums. First, you know it, but to other members of the audience today, is that Poland has experienced a museum boom after 1989, and more specifically since late 1990s. We have several hundred new museums, and many of the core exhibitions completely remained or significantly remain. And initially that was a part of changing history narratives after the communist period, and this example is the Auschwitz Memorial Museum. But then you've seen this of investment, especially of local governments, but also private institutions, or churches more specifically, because not only Catholic Church, but also other churches are engaged in it. So we have several hundred new museums, and you have massive numbers of visitors. The statistics, the pre-pandemic statistics give more than 38 million visits to Polish museums, which is more than the population of the country. And much more than the number of people who were watching football matches. This is quite interesting. Why is it so? It's a topic for a separate study. I believe there is an important contribution of the communist policies of communist Poland in making museums, visit to a museum, a part of the school curricula. So we see that Poles want to go to the museum, at least many of them want to go, not all of them, but many of them go, and those who go quite frequently. Second, that local governments, that politicians at various levels are ready to invest, that various institutions that want to strengthen the position or authority or image, but also build related identities, which may be, for example, identities of workers of an industry or inhabitants of a town or a region, resort to museum as a medium. And finally, I believe there is because the question should be why the leaders of the Kaczyński party, why Mr. Kaczyński and his friends believe in museums, why they have invested so much. And I can send you this list. I have taken it from the Ministry of Culture. How many museums they have made national museums, museums that had been regional or local, became national museums or became partnerships with the national government, which means pumping in money from the central budget, or from the national budget. I suppose that this is a follow-up to the successful example of the first narrative historical museum in Poland, which was the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, opened in the early 21st century and established by Lech Kaczyński, the twin brother of Mr. Jarosław Kaczyński, who later on died in a plane crash. So he was the founding father of this museum, which was extremely successful, not only in attracting mass audience, but also in helping him win the elections, presidential elections later on. And I remember a meeting with Lech Kaczyński when he was the mayor of Warsaw, when many people praised him for building the museum for this great catastrophe of Warsaw, almost complete destruction of the city during and after the uprising of 1944. So they follow up. Are they right? I don't know. However, I believe there is one argument which I don't tell loudly in Poland, not to give it to Mr. Kaczyński and his colleagues, but I can say it here. Namely, I believe that while audiences, various groups of people, citizens, have gradually learned how to be critical in reading texts, in critical approach to textual information, they are almost defenseless in face of the visual information, and even more so in face of this complex message coming from the space, the visual, the text, the sound, the presence of other people, which makes an exhibition. You know it much better than me that exhibitions are complex instruments operating at various levels to various senses. And it seems to me that the critical ability to critically respond to exhibitions, especially immersive ones, make the public vulnerable to the messages, to the content of such exhibitions. I don't know if the strategies of the Populist Party are so sophisticated to think in these terms. Maybe they just want to control big institutions. They think in etatist terms, like the IPN. Let's make something big and state-owned. Or they follow the example of the Warsaw Rising Museum, maybe a little bit of all of it. So this is my reply to your question. A very good question about other relevant others in Polish history: Germans, Ukrainians, Russians, and so on. I have a kind of a déjà vu feeling when I meet the Populist Party propaganda about Germany, which is our big ally, the biggest economic partner, and fellow European in the European Union. It's so much similar to the 1960s propaganda of the Gomułka era, including claims that there is this insidious German memory policy to put the blame of the Holocaust on Poland. Yes, I have heard it, and I have heard it in the presidential palace some time ago in Warsaw. So I'm really surprised by incredible patience of German leaders facing the stream of slander. Germans systematically respond, for example, that we, the Germans, Germany is fully responsible for the Holocaust, which even some of our colleagues have criticized this position. Regarding Ukraine, with Ukraine, I think there is a kind of ambiguity. On one hand, having the common enemy, which is the Russia of Mr. Putin, makes the xenophobic sentiments and policies of the Populist Party a little bit more moderate. The same is with the very good relations with Israel. But for example, the infamous 2018 Holocaust complicity law, which is known abroad because of this debate of it penalized certain statements of the complicity of the Polish nation and state in the Nazi crimes. But a forgotten chapter of it, a forgotten paragraph of it, was very much anti-Ukrainian and put in the languages, clearly coming from Russian propaganda, that denying the crimes of Ukrainian nationalists should be penalized too. And it was not amended, by the way. This is the remaining part of it. We have example of harassment. For example, our Minister of Education and Science, Mr. Czarnek. I've started my interest in this person when he personally was harassing a Ukrainian historian who was publicly speaking about the crimes committed by the Polish underground against Ukrainian civilians in the 1940s. So he sent public prosecutors to this historian, and then the man lost his job and so on. So there is some moderation because of Russia, but otherwise, Ukrainians are maybe a favorite target of this aggressive memory policy. And finally, the question of publishing and reviewing. Oh, I'm not an expert in it. I'm just an author of some articles. Sometimes I am a reviewer. But what I can say is that IPN dominates the market of history publishing. Every year, it publishes hundreds of books, more than I suppose the next 5 publishers combined. So it dominates the market, and I deliberately speak in economic terms because it's a quasi-monopoly solution. They don't monopolize, but they dominate it. If they were a company, immediately an antitrust agency should intervene. Second, they distort the market, because when you are not an expert in historiography, and you see 3 books on similar topics, and one of them is 50% cheaper because subsidized, and this is the IPN publication, well, you may choose the cheaper one on the same topic. So I know the private publishers were very much concerned about it. Also, the university publishers, facing such a competition with unlimited budgets, it's very difficult. How is the process of reviewing of these books? I have no idea. I have no idea. I suppose you can always pick up the right reviewer, and we know examples of these right reviewers. Although the previous Minister of Science was insisting on the proper procedures, double-blinded peer review and so on. As a historian of communist Poland, I know that you can easily invent tricks to play with the system, to go around it.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's give a chance to Dr. Trębacz. Dr. Trębacz, please go ahead.
Thank you. I won't have much to add. I will start with the last question. From my personal experience with peer reviewing for the journals, for the academic journals right now in Poland, I think that we have an honest process of peer reviewing. I know that negative reviews are being submitted, so it shows that the reviewers read the article and thought if it's worth to be published or not, and stated why it was worth or not publishing. So this would be my first-hand views on that. As it goes for the EPN, I think that it was some time ago that the books were supposed to be reviewed only by another IPN worker. You didn't have to get an outside review to publish the book. And looking at the amount of books and other publications that the IPN is doing, this was not a very good process of reviewing, because a lot of things that there was no need for such a book to be published were published. A lot of very a lot of topics that were supposed to be only a larger article were published as a book. There was a trend to publish historical sources on an extensive, in a very extensive way. So this was not a very solid reviewed process, I think, and it was like this some years ago. I don't think that it has changed much in right now. As it goes for the question about that Erika stated about why the museums are in such an interest. I would agree with Professor Stola, this is his last statement, and I would add to it that not many Poles will read a book and not read a book, a historical book, but a lot of them will visit a museum, so it is easier to subsidize a museum. And it's very important to subsidize a correct museum. It's important to subsidize a correct museum with a correct exhibition, because when people will go out from the museum, they will remember not a lot, but some things only. And when you look at the discussion over the Second World War Museum, one of the arguments was that Irena Sendler didn't get a place at the museum that she's supposed to be getting. And one of the changes made at the museum was to put in front Irena Sendler as one of the examples of the history of the 20th century and the Polish-Jewish relations during the Second World War. It's also interesting why a monument of Witold Pilecki is standing before the Museum of the Second World War. It's interesting why there is such a large discussion whether a monument of the Poles saving the Jews during the Second World War should be also in front of the Museum of the History of the Polish Jews. People will remember only symbols when they get out from the museum, and one of the symbols should be correct ones. So I think this is the explanation that I would have on this question. And if it goes for Germans and Ukrainians, I'm not an expert in this, so I would like to give any thoughts on this because I did not investigate it, and I see only the fact that right now, especially the Pilecki Institute and the Institute of National Remembrance are very much expressing the fact that the Germans were those who were responsible for the Holocaust, but they were also responsible for the suffering of the Poles. It's always like this. It's always like, yes, 3 million Jews were killed, but also 3 million Poles were killed during the Second World War. Did you know that? Did you know that Polish intelligentsia was being murdered during the Second World War? And they tend to forget that this action against the Polish intelligentsia was not an action about the action against Poles, but action against intelligentsia, and intelligentsia in the very broad meaning of this word. There were a lot of communists murdered at that time, a lot of Jews, Ukrainians, Germans also murdered by the Nazis after they entered Poland. This was not an action imposed against ethnic Poles whatsoever. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Trębacz, you have said something very important during your presentation. And if I may, I would like to steal some time and return to this. You mentioned polarization as a phenomenon among scholars. And yes, I would think this is the most dangerous phenomenon, because as far as the employees of IPN are concerned or certain museums, you can fire them, right? Law and Justice would go. Eventually, there would be a new government. They would fire these people and new people would come. But intellectually or intellectual consequences are much more important and complicated, because speaking with some exaggeration only, there is a very dangerous situation in Poland, scholarly speaking. You belong to this group or you belong to that group. And don't dare to be somewhere in between, because both groups will eat you alive as a consequence of this. And this polarization contributes to the crisis of our historical profession. And this crisis of historical profession is not just a Polish phenomenon. This is a worldwide phenomenon now. If you read The Guardian, you know that several English universities are going to close their history departments because they came to the conclusion, what for? These are, you know, political activists. We have enough of political activists. I was educated as a historian in the early 70s. Some of my professors were educated before World War II. I got a certain positivist image of history or doing history. Now it's all gone. Now history is written in a completely different way. The ideals of my professors are gone. Nobody talks about this seriously. So don't you think that this polarization of intellectual world, which takes place everywhere, is particularly difficult or particularly dangerous in Poland, and that it will have a long time consequences, that this is not only a matter of, 5-6 years, new government will come, everything will change, but there will be an entire generation or two educated in such a way that you are either here or there. And if you want to do something in between, well, you are damned. How about this, gentlemen?
Is this the question
Stola,
for
please start.
Well, first, I agree, and I can give you some examples of even more perverse consequences of this polarization. I would give you two. One is that quite recently, I really wanted to criticize a colleague of mine for what he has written in his recent book, but I decided not to because he's under fire from the Populist Party.
Exactly.
Second, I never criticized, the servile historians who serve the Populist Party memory policy just because who they are, but only for what they have written or said. They have written enough of stupid things to be critical. I don't have to invent it. However, I realized that I go a step further. Namely, in many cases, I don't waste my time to read what they have written because I assume it must be bullshit. So I exclude in advance any possibility of discussion with someone whom I believe have compromised himself intellectually or morally. I believe is related, the moral decline is combined with the intellectual decline in this field. So, and that's the problem. However, I'm a little bit optimistic about these generations because I have seen in my life a big shift from the gap between historians whose formative experience was opposition to the communist regime, like me, and those who are trying to defend the legacy of communist Poland, social progress, education, liquidation of illiteracy, building of industry, whatever. And it seemed that this is a gap for life. Now, facing the Populist Party, I realize they are nice guys, or at least many of them. So I think the lines of division may change. And because of the general acceleration of history, they change faster than they used to in the past. So I'm very pessimistic about the consequences of the present polarization, but I'm more optimistic about how lasting they are.
Mr. Trębacz.
I would be more pessimistic than Professor Stola right now. And I will try to say again from a personal experience. In 2019, we organized a conference which was about the Jewish involvement in the leftist movements in the 19th and 20th century. So a topic that should be a very interesting one for the right-wing historians to say how many Jews were the members of the Communist Party and how many of them also were responsible for murdering Poles after the Second World War. And we were organizing an open debate, or wanted to organize an open debate, and we were really open for a possibility to have the representatives of both sides, at least the representatives of both sides that we would agree to have. And it was impossible to find either one representative of one side to agree to speak with the representative of the other, or the opposite. So we decided not to do. So we were forced not to do the debate because there was nobody to debate with. And we decided that there is no need to do a debate when in which two persons will agree with each other. So this is a problem that I face. And when I look right now at the discussion that is led by the Pilecki Institute, and I observe the discussion not only in the printed media, but also in the internet, on Facebook, etc. And when I see how blinded this opposite, from my point of view, side is for the arguments that they're being given, it shows me that there is no space for discussion. If they do not acknowledge the fact that the trial against Engelking and Grabowski was a political one, so what's the point? Where's the starting point for the debate? There is no base on which we can discuss anymore. So this is why I'm very pessimistic. I don't know how the academia will look like in a few years, but I presume that it will get worse and worse right now, and that there is no way to close this gap that is being created for a few years, to be honest, right now.
Well, since our time is almost over, I would like to close this with my mantra that I use after every lecture I deliver at my university. And the mantra is questions, disagreements, angry protests. Are there angry protests here? Did we say something awful? You disagree completely?
I can say it if you wish.
Go ahead. All right, so Vasily, you are in charge of time and everything, so it's back to you.
Thank you very much, Piotr, Dariusz, and Michał. It was a really terrific discussion, presentations. I learned a lot. And before closing, I have two announcements. First, I would like to voice my own optimism because, well, as history teaches us, Stalin in the USSR managed to polarize even the hard sciences, making physics and biology bourgeois and socialist. But they survived, so our profession will survive, and everything will be okay in time. In 2 weeks, the REES, so that's on behalf of Jewish Studies program at Queen's, will have an event related to Polish Jewish history. It will be the book presentation by Professor Diego Rotman, who's the head of the Department of Theatrical Studies at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And his book is on Jigan and Schumacher, comedy duo called the Theater as the Temporary Home. And discussion will be a joint project as this one. There will be Diego, the author, Professor Anna Sternschiss from University of Toronto, the head of the Jewish Studies program, and myself. May 26, and I will email the list so you'll see, and if you're interested, please attend. Again, thank you very much to everybody, and hopefully I'll see you at our next events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. Bye bye.